Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome back after a bank holiday break to another edition of the Mogcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, Jacob, before we get on to high and low politics, our readers have an insatiable curiosity to know every detail of your life and will badger me if I don't ask you to know what you did for the royal wedding.
Oh, well, I was lucky enough to be able to watch it before going to another wedding. A friend of mine was getting married in Warwickshire, so I watched the royal wedding and much enjoyed it. Played sermon cricket during the Chicago Bishop's homily, where my son, I think, worked out there were 39 runs and 4 wickets, but not all of it did you have the camera on the Reverend.
Stop there, stop. What is sermon cricket? For those of our readers who don't know, I've never heard of it.
Sermon cricket is something you can play when clerics are effusive with their hand movements. And it's difficult to explain on a podcast, but when they wag their finger, that's a wicket. When they extend their arms high and wide, that's a 6. Obviously, when they're just straight wide, that's a wide. And you go through the umpire's signals. I once was at a church in Brazil, and I didn't understand Portuguese, so the only thing to do was to play sermon cricket. And I got through 3 completed innings and was well into the 4th innings before the sermon finished.
I didn't see the sermon on Saturday, but I would guess, having read it, I've read the full sermon, and there were a lot of wides and 6s.
You're quite right, but the runs came from wides and 6s. There weren't many 4s. You rarely get 4s, actually.
What's the 4? How do you do a 4?
Well, that's the arm going side to side.
You sort of sweep.
Yes.
That would be pretty rare. I apologise to readers who are champing at the bit too, to hear more about Brexit for this cricketing and wedding interlude. So let's now get on to Brexit after a break of 2 weeks. I want to do this, have this conversation, just by really going back and reviewing much of what's happened during the year, step by step. So, you weren't very happy, were you, with the transition arrangements whereby fishing won't be repatriated at all during the transition, and free movement will continue as at present during the transition?
No, my greatest concern about it was that it contradicted assurances that had been given by the government very shortly before the transition was agreed. So we were told fishing would not be part of it a few days before, and the Prime Minister on a trip to China had said free movement would not be part of it a few weeks before. And inevitably, it is disconcerting when the government says one thing and then agrees to do another. And in terms of these negotiations, particularly as they're led by somebody who backed Remain, trust is very important, and it's very important that the government maintains faith with those who voted to leave.
We've established you weren't very happy about the transition arrangement. Were you any happier about the outcome of the Chequers summit, in which it emerged that we will be aligned in certain regulatory matters with the EU very closely?
Some of that's a statement of the obvious, that there are some standards that are international standards that are implemented through the EU that other countries implement anyway, that if you think of car manufacturing regulations, they're the oddly named European Committee of the United Nations. It's not actually European Committee, it's the United Nations Committee. And those rules are accepted worldwide. So having alignment on things that we were always going to be aligned on and admitting it is not problematic. Aligning more broadly than that would become problematic.
I'm going to do something that's rather like sermon cricket, where I'm going to sort of score Jacob Rees-Mogg unhappiness with, or happiness, with various actions the government's done. And it seems to me you were very unhappy about transition.
But transition is livable.
Less unhappy about the Chequers summit.
But transition was livable with on the basis that it ended.
Well, we'll come back to that later. I'm just trying to get through what's happened so far without looking ahead. We can start looking ahead later. Then there was the customs partnership idea, which we know was not approved in a cabinet committee meeting. Most members of the cabinet committee concerned don't seem to like it, but it still hasn't been put to bed and is there without a stake through its heart. How do you feel about that?
The customs partnership is not leaving the single market and the customs union. It would be a considerable failure of government policy. It's one of those ideas that, before anybody had thought it through, sounded quite attractive, but on any detailed analysis is effectively remaining in the European Union. And I'm surprised that the Prime Minister is still plodding on with this not very satisfactory idea.
Well, you're very unhappy with that. That's 2 out of 3. And there's then the idea put around that we'll have to postpone coming out of the customs union beyond the end of transition because the systems won't be ready. Do you think that will happen? And how do you feel about the prospect of it happening?
I think for the government to be preparing for failure 2.5 years before the point at which they ought to be ready is just weak. That governments should prepare for success. And if they find shortly beforehand that they need a fallback position, that is when it should be drawn up. But to go into the negotiations to say to Mr. Barnier, we will kowtow before you in every way you possibly want if we cannot get everything ready by the due date, encourages him to say, oh, we'll just kowtow, I'm quite happy, and make no effort to come to a sensible agreement. I think it is a sign of abject weakness.
Well, you're very unhappy about the prospect of postponing leaving the customs union. You're very unhappy about the partnership. You're very unhappy about transition. That's 3 of the 4. We now come to the backstop and the agreement apparently reached last week, which does require a bit of explanation to the readers, because the backstop was written into the deal agreed by the government and by the European Union at Christmas. I think it's fair to say that at that point it seemed somewhat remote. But it now seems to me that it looks a little nearer, in the sense that my understanding is that if you can't get agreement about a trade deal, the backstop kicks in. And that we may not get a trade deal, some people would think it's very unlikely, in a fully fledged form, before Brexit Day on the 29th of March next year. So out we go into this backstop limbo, whereby we're aligned to the rules of the customs union, we're aligned to the rules of the single market. This is effectively what you could call EEA light. Nothing's really changed.
If we say to the EU, our backstop position is that we will be the vassal state, why should the EU make any effort to make any arrangement other than for us to be a vassal state? This was always a problem with what was agreed in December, and the problem with having creative ambiguity, which is simply a way of trying to gull voters. Actually, governments should not have creative ambiguity. They should be straight with electorates about what they mean, and they should say what they mean and then do it. And I'm afraid this backstop is becoming very attractive for the European Union not to offer us anything further, and therefore it is essentially a trap.
What should the government do?
What should the government do? The government should make preparations faster than it is for leaving without a deal. It should be ready to do that because it's an essential part of the negotiation. It's not to say they want to leave without a deal, or even that I want to leave without a deal, but that it would be something a wise government would have spent much more time preparing, and it's been weak about that. The other thing that it should do is make it absolutely clear that the money is in return for a trade deal, and that if we don't get a trade deal, and if we don't have it ready to sign immediately after the 29th of March, then the EU will not get any money from us, and that no payments will be made until that deal is made. The money is our strongest card, and it seems at the moment to have been given away with nothing in return. So I think we need some backbone in these negotiations, and we need the government to recognise that there is strength in its position. And I fear we're getting to the point where you wonder whether the government really wants to leave at all. I mean, if you take this thing we've had on Northern Ireland, the Prime Minister has set the hair running that Northern Ireland might, in a border poll, vote for a united Ireland. It's quite useful to look at the Belfast Agreement on that, because it says that the Secretary of State shall exercise the power if at any time it appears likely to him that a majority of those voting would express a wish that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of United Ireland. If the Prime Minister really believes that a border poll would go against the Union, then the Prime Minister's Secretary of State has a legal obligation to call that poll. And it is quite extraordinary that Downing Street has set this hare running. It seems very unlikely with all the polling evidence poll out today that only 21% want a united Ireland. But why is the government saying this? If it really believes it, it has a legal obligation. If it doesn't believe it, it's just another example of Project Fear. And I'm deeply concerned that the government is not only not backing its avowed policy at the moment, it's deliberately undermining it.
Isn't the government's argument that, look, Jacob, we're very worried about not reaching a settlement that's agreeable to the government of Ireland and the European Union on what happens to the UK-Ireland border, because if we don't reach a settlement, it's going to inflame nationalist sentiment. If it inflames nationalist sentiment, we'll have to call a border poll. If we call a border poll, Northern Ireland may vote to leave the UK.
If the government thinks the Northern Irish will vote to leave the UK, it has to call a border poll anyway. It's not within its gift, it's in the law.
Yes.
Belfast Agreement.
But the government's argument is, look, Jacob, you and your kind are making this more likely by being so obdurate about the Irish border and about the deal we're trying to strike.
It's a classic rerun of Project Fear. It's exactly what they did about Scotland. They said, if we vote to leave the European Union, it will reignite support for independence in Scotland. That wasn't quite what happened. And I do think it's surprising that the government is actually briefing against its own policy rather than in favour of its own policy.
You think there's no polling evidence to support the view that there's a head of steam gathering in Northern Ireland for Irish unity?
There have been a couple of polls this morning that have shown the precise opposite. It depends inevitably with polls how you phrase the question. There are some questions that come up with surprising answers, but the basic polling evidence is that it's at about 20%, just over, who want to join the Republic of Ireland.
Now, Sam Coates of The Times reported that you had precisely this exchange with the Prime Minister in Downing Street. Was that correct?
Well, my view is that private conversations in Downing Street should not be leaked. It has been so widely reported that I think it's fair to confirm that it is true, but I disapprove of private conversations being leaked.
Just a moment ago, before we got into this section of the conversation, you said words to the effect of that you now are beginning to doubt whether the government really wants to leave the EU at all. Now, I think that's the first time in these conversations I've heard you say that. I think previously you said, when, for example, the subject of transition has come up, it's very bad, but what really matters is the end state. And now you're saying, I'm very worried about the government delivering a proper end state.
I am very worried that I think you see that the government's words remain robust and its deeds become weak. The Prime Minister wrote an article a fortnight ago or so for The Sun on Sunday saying we'd be out of the customs union, out of the single market, we would stop paying over money and we'd be out of the ECJ. And then a few days later you get statement saying we're going to have an indefinite customs union and that's our transition period. Now, you've got to judge people ultimately by their actions rather than their words. Fine words are well known for not buttering parsnips. And we are not getting our parsnips buttered at the moment.
Just to sum it up, I want to see if you agree with the take I've reached, not because I want to reach it, it's where I think the facts are pointing after looking at the events of recent weeks. In 2016, the position the Prime Minister announced at the Conservative Party conference was, we're moving Article 50, we will be out of ECJ jurisdiction, we're leaving the single market and the customs union, that's a view she clarified at Lancaster House. And the whole framework of the speech was global Britain. We will be free to strike our own trade deals. Now, as I understand the backstop, you effectively remain UK-wide, the government says, within the basic framework of the customs union for as long as the backstop exists. You have something called full alignment, the meaning of which is disputed. But one reading is this is full regulatory alignment. So you're not only in the customs union, you're in effect in the single market for manufactures and agriculture. You are outside the common commercial policy, but inside the common external tariff. So there's no incentive with anyone to strike trade deals because you're bound by the tariffs. And you looks as though you come within the ambit of the European Court. Now, this seems to be the position. And if that is right, there's nothing much left of the Prime Minister's original speech in 2016.
That is not leaving the European Union. And the point on regulatory alignment is crucial, that if you look at countries that are either in the customs union or in the single market, but not in both, they still have border controls between their countries and the European Union. Therefore, we have a lot of talk about the customs union, which actually means the single market as well, because the aim of being in the customs union is to avoid border controls, but you don't avoid that unless you have full regulatory alignment, because otherwise goods that come into this country would have to be checked before they went out to the European Union for regulatory rather than tariff reasons. And I think there is an element of spin around the talk of customs union when in reality it means the single market too. And that's the problem with the customs partnership, other than its impracticability, its bureaucratic nature, and its failure to give us anything we could offer to other countries.
Do you think David Davis should resign?
No, I don't. I think it's important that he remains there and keeps on fighting the corner, which he is doggedly fighting, along with the other DExEU ministers, to ensure that this is in the end done properly.
And just to be clear, do you think any of them should resign? Liam Fox, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove?
I don't think anybody should resign.
Have you lost faith in the Prime Minister?
That would be a harsh way of putting it.
But not an inexact way of putting it?
No, I'm not going that far. But I have doubts. I have doubts that what she says is still fine and what she does is not delivering on what she says. And that inevitably raises concerns, and she needs to bring the two together, and the June summit would be an opportunity for her to do that.
Do you think that this backstop clarification was agreed in advance with key players within the EU? I just simply ask because, as you know, there are worries about the backstop in the EU. Let's look at the whole picture for a moment, in that there are voices within the EU saying, hang on a moment, we can't have the Brits enjoying access to one of the four freedoms without them having access to all the four freedoms, without us insisting on what we've always insisted on this theological point. You can't have one without the other three. Oh, we can't let this backstop idea pass.
I don't know. There is a theory that this is a very clever, cunning plan thought up by the government. Governments rarely manage to think up very cunning plans of this kind, but I have no evidence one way or the other as to whether it's been agreed with Brussels or not.
On a different subject, I think we've explored Brexit fairly thoroughly. How do you feel looking around at this extraordinary launch of new groups within the Conservative Party and revival of old institutions? So we had a launch of essays by some of your colleagues for the Centre for Policy Studies last week. We had the launch of FREER. We have the launch of Onward this evening. What's going on? Does it all mean anything?
I think it's really exciting, actually. I think the Conservative Party needs ideas beyond Brexit, that there are issues facing the government, facing the country, that need answers, and there's been a slight desert of good ideas. You see, the Conservatives essentially bought into the New Labour consensus in 2005 and decided that we'd govern, if we ever got in again, as New Labour light, and that meant that ideas were considered a bit dangerous. And I think there is a real importance in having interesting new ideas that can try and improve the condition of the British people. That's what we should be working towards, and that needs people to be thinking things, and it needs people to be thinking things that sometimes get criticised and lead to political argument and debate, because that's the way to mobilise ideas.
Has any of the ideas any of these groups produced struck you particularly strongly? Have you had a eureka moment, silent upon the peak of Darien, as you gaze upon an idea that the CPS or FREER have produced?
Well, it's early days. I mean, we're getting the ideas beginning, we're getting the groups reforming. So no, I don't think there's a eureka moment yet, but perhaps one will come.
And it is different, isn't it? You weren't in the Commons then, and we were all even younger than we are today. But in 1995-6, my sense is there was a certain exhaustion about the Conservative Party. You were facing Blair, not Corbyn. The Conservatives were a long way behind in the polls. At the moment they're ahead. Things looked pretty grim and turned out to be. Whereas in fact, despite this gloomy landscape we were discussing earlier, the Conservatives are not doing at all badly in the polls.
No, doing very well in the polls. The local election results were good. The national polling level is very encouraging. This even led to some rather dangerous talk, in my view, of having another snap election, but a fool returneth to his folly comes to mind, and I don't think this folly will be something we return to. But yes, there isn't that sense of tiredness. You're absolutely right. There is a sense that we need new ideas, because the initial part of the coalition and then Conservative government was really putting things right that had been messed up, rather than thinking, how do we develop exciting Conservative ideas? Now is the chance to think, what ideas can we offer to the country?
You don't think there'll be a snap election, by the way, do you?
I think it's unlikely.
Surely your colleagues would go nuts at the very thought of being dragged through another election.
Well, I'm not sure that if another election were proposed, the two-thirds majority of MPs to support it would be achieved. And I don't think the government's going to lose a vote of no confidence. So the two routes of getting it, I think, are quite hard to achieve.
Where were the nearest set of local government elections to you in Somerset? We've not spoken since the local elections.
Somerset wasn't having any load, because I'm a unitary authority and the county council wasn't out. The such work as I did in Westminster.
You didn't have any authorities near you in thirds?
No. I'm not. Bristol used to go in thirds, but I don't think there was a Bristol election this year.
Tell me what you thought about the Westminster result. You just said you were active there, because on Con Home we've had a look at what happened in Barnet, we've had a look at what happened in Trafford. I think we're going to have a look at what happened in Wandsworth. We've not really put Westminster under the magnifying glass. So tell me about your impressions of what happened in what Labour rather unwisely talked up as a key target for them.
Well, we almost lost Westminster in 1986. And at the low point of Conservative fortunes, even Westminster is a risk. And the Conservatives in Westminster, and I'm biased because I used to be chairman of the City of London Westminster Conservative Association, have done a remarkable job in making a city that could very easily not be Conservative, consistently Conservative, and winning council seats with a large quantity of social housing in them. So Westminster Conservatives have done a really good job, and they did it again. They campaigned very hard, very effectively, and held on pretty comfortably. It was much, much better than 1986.
Which result there at ward level was most impressive from a Conservative point of view?
That's always hard to say, and I know Westminster South better than Westminster North, but in the Churchill ward, one of the Labour councillors had become a Conservative, and he was successfully re-elected, which was important in a ward that would naturally be Labour.
I'm going to go back for a minute to Onward, who will have launched and be going onward and upward by the time this podcast is broadcast. They're placing enormous stress, I mean, rightly, as so many people do, on housing. If you were Secretary of State for Housing and you had free rein, what would you do?
Well, start at the beginning and look at the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. The idea that centralised state planning is ever going to lead to solutions is a false one, as we know in other areas where the state has tried to plan and provide doesn't work. So you want to go back to first principles. You then want to think what do people actually want, and then you have to try and work out how you deliver it, and you have to make sure that it looks nice, because I think we have far too much housing that is built simply to squeeze as much housing into a small space as possible, because the row over getting any extra land for planning permission is so great. I think you need to revisit the green belt, because a lot of green belt is not very nice land. It's not area of outstanding natural beauty. Actually, Labour MP said that. She said that she thinks 1 million houses could be built in London on essentially scrub green belt. Now, I haven't looked acre by acre at this land, but I think that's something we should be thinking about. But I also think we should reverse the trend to build smaller houses at greater density and go back to giving people a little bit more space and lower density and actually using a little bit more land for it, because a garden is just as much a green space as a field is. And what people have consistently said they want in surveys going back to the 1940s are houses with gardens.
I'm making a resolution next time we come back, regardless of what's happening with Brexit, to return to housing, because what you've just said about challenging the premise on which we work, the act passed by the post-war Labour government and the Green Belt, is so interesting. It deserves a bit of knockabout. Sadly, it's all we have time for this week, other than for me to say, as usual, Jacob, thank you very much.
Well, and thank you for all you've been writing. I was very concerned to read that I was a toad in a pan of increasingly warming water, and I shall do my best to jump out.
The readers and others will note that with due care. Thank you very much.
The Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.